A man is known by his appearance, and a sensible man is known by his face when you meet him. A man's attire and open-mouthed laughter, and a man's manner of walking show what he is. Sirach, chapter 19. It is a too seldom noticed aspect of the demise of Western civilization, though ironically it can be seen every day. Manners, in the sense of shared or customary forms that govern social comportment, are vanishing. In large segments of society and some areas of life, they are practically gone. Perhaps what is most alarming is a growing number of people are not even conscious of the loss, at least in part because they have never known anything else. This is not to say that they don't feel it, but rather they do not grasp what it is that is missing. And so they live in ignorance of the power and importance of the manners we do not have. Those who are conscious of it, usually the older among us, find themselves baffled and isolated. How could this have happened, they wonder, and what can we do? My lecture has 3 parts. What has happened to manners? Why do manners matter anyway? And what might we do to reclaim them? A couple of months ago, my 82-year-old mother walked into an auto shop here in the Shenandoah Valley town where we live. I had gotten my car inspected there and had informed her that it was a reasonable place to get the required Virginia annual inspection. Later, she recounted to me her experience. As she walked into the small customer reception area of the shop, 2 servicemen were behind the desk speaking to one another. As my mother approached them, she is remarkably spry, but nonetheless she has a hoary head and moves rather slowly. Neither of the men looked up. No greeting, no recognition, not even a flinch. And as my mother stood there, purse in hand, waiting, they continued to talk and talk. Finally, my mother ventured to say, "Excuse me, can I get my car inspected?" One of the men turned and said, "Yeah, we'll be with you shortly." And they went back to talking. As my mother related this to me, she seemed to be holding back tears. She then said, rather sheepishly, "I'm not going back there again." I think this experience bordered on traumatic for my mother. To suggest that this is simply because times they are a-changin' misses a fundamental point. Though I trust those 2 men were not intentionally bad to my mother, their actions were reprehensible. Indeed, by any reasonable standard, they were inhuman. The question, what has happened in the last couple of generations, is as complex as it is important. Here I will offer a few thoughts on some of the deeper aspects of the changes, without purporting to give a sufficient or complete account. A major trend in our culture has been a rejection of authority and tradition. Age-old customs and manners and etiquette have fallen prey to this broader trend. To many, there seems to be no reason why we should continue observing the practices of prior generations, especially when these practices are expressive of old-fashioned views that smack of hierarchy, patriarchy, of Victorian sexual ethics, etc. A more subtle and harder to understand trend can be called a dualism about the human person, a view that tends to reduce the body to its material functions, severing it from its intimate connection to the spiritual soul, a connection that in reality gives context and meaning to all bodily actions. Put otherwise, an increasingly materialistic and hedonist worldview deprives the human body of its spiritual homeland and connections, thereby removing the most significant reasons for honoring the body and for disciplining its inclinations. The older view of man as an essentially composite reality, a view expressed by the Greeks and developed by the Christian tradition, grounded a conviction about the importance of manners. In other words, the old worldview went hand in hand with an appreciation for and practice of manners. Yet now, even among those who have not actually rejected this view, many practices that express the modern dualism have effectively replaced the older practices. Mere vestiges of the old ways remain here and there. As Richard Weaver said, ideas have consequences, though often it takes some length of time for broad intellectual and moral trends to mold the daily practices of the masses. But, ladies and gentlemen, I dare say the penetration of modern dualism, materialism, and other related isms into the daily life of the masses is reaching a significant point. This penetration can be seen in more than one way. It can especially be seen in the area of manners. Please allow me to be blunt. The degeneration of manners is not restricted to those who have more or less explicitly thrown off the yoke of traditional morality. Even within communities and families that retain, with remarkable fidelity, the intellectual and moral convictions of the Christian tradition, the customary manners that in varying forms have always gone along with such convictions are often not being passed on. Let me be clear. I say this not to blame and point a finger. The negative power of the cultural milieu today should not be underestimated. We might recall that St. John Paul II referred to the ubiquitous tentacles of the culture of death. My point here today is to offer some suggestions as to how this predicament might be addressed. But the first key step is to have some sense of the predicament in which we find ourselves. I turn now to the second part of my lecture, which we might call the so what part. In other words, why do customs in manners really matter? I will begin with a remarkable quotation from Plato's Republic. The exact context is not especially important. The prophetic aspect is almost eerie. You ready for this? These people will also discover the seemingly insignificant conventions their predecessors have destroyed. Things like this: when it is proper for the young to be silent in front of their elders, when they should make way for them or stand up in their presence, the care of parents, hairstyles, the clothes and shoes to wear, deportment, and everything else of that sort. End quote. It is clear that Plato considers the loss of customary manners, even seemingly insignificant ones, to be a serious matter. I will offer some thoughts to help us consider why. The most fundamental point, I think, has been captured well by Leon Kass in his great book, The Hungry Soul, Eating and the Perfection of Human Nature. He writes, quote, "Etiquette and ethics, rightly understood, are in fact continuous, partly because character is often revealed in outward display. Moreover, the principles of self-command and consideration for others, shown in small manners, are of a piece with virtue and justice. Indeed, civility may very well be the heart of the ethics of everyday life." End quote. Manners are how we enact our humanity well in a host of everyday interactions with others. Manners give concrete form to the moral dispositions of our heart and soul. In other words, they direct us regarding how to live out our convictions in what otherwise might be the overlooked corners of our day. How do I live out love for my neighbor? How do I show respect for those that I must respect? How do I live out a central truth of human existence, namely that I am part of a community, the common good of which is my own greatest good? Manners give us concrete direction about how to do these things in numerous social circumstances. At work here is a great philosophical and theological principle. For us humans, spiritual realities must be incarnated. I would go so far as to say that spiritual dispositions not incarnated in some way are either already deficient or are in danger of being lost. And manners are a key way that we incarnate our moral dispositions toward others. Manners help mold our bodily actions to be in accord with our worldview. Through and in them, what we are on the inside becomes complete. We should note that inasmuch as manners are themselves exterior forms, they can be practiced in the absence of proper interior dispositions. This can be a reprehensible hypocrisy. Yet, our very repulsion from such a disconnect serves to highlight the real connection between manners and morals. Another important aspect of manners is that they give us a fixed and common language. Consider, if we did not share a spoken and written language such as English, we couldn't communicate what we need to communicate to one another. Similarly, manners provide the necessary language to communicate things that need communicating. Let's take a simple example. A young person walks into the home of his friend. There in the foyer are the friend's parents. It is evident that the young person should feel the difference between himself and them. He should feel respect for his friend's parents. But how is he to show it? Manners provide the form in which to do it. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. McDonald. I'm David Gordon. Pleased to meet you. It's all too evident that the person might feel respect, but nonetheless not express it. Often this will be due to the fact that the person has not been trained in the accepted forms of manners. And so we have hands in the pockets, eyes on the floor, silence. The young person means no disrespect, but in his ignorance, perhaps even paralysis, a kind of disrespect is being enacted. Recall, my mother reasonably felt mistreated, even though there may well have been no intentional mistreatment, but something was objectively missing. How many elderly people who already tend to feel alone and isolated are deprived of the attention they are due by our lack of shared rituals, in other words, of a shared language of respect for them. Now, a close look at this situation reveals even more in our loss of manners than an inability to express good interior dispositions. Let's go back to our example of the young person in the presence of his friend's parents. We took for granted that there was an interior disposition, in this case respect, which was not expressed because of a lack of a shared language by which to express it. But a deeper problem looms. The shared language of expressing these dispositions is perhaps the most fundamental way in which such dispositions are cultivated and come into existence in the first place. Young children should be taught to respond to adults in certain ways, precisely so that such responses bring about the right disposition. The child who has been trained to stand at attention and recite certain formulae should begin over time to feel, if you will, an appropriate deference. He learns from a young age to notice and respond to certain key realities, age difference, sex difference, etc. The child becomes increasingly aware of these realities, eventually noticing and responding to them by habit. The child without manners, on the other hand, is the child who might not even see these fundamental realities. When he walks into the foyer, the presence of his friend's parents might not even strike him. He actually might not see or feel the reality of the situation. The reality is, he's in the presence of elders who deserve his piety. But those adults might just as well be decorative pictures on the wall. And this child moves on in numb ignorance of the situation in which he lives. I don't want to be overly dramatic. I rarely am. But it's this aspect that I find especially striking. The blindness of what is in effect a rather solipsistic world in which people, especially so many young people, now live as they move past and around one another in increasing isolation and loneliness. Personal ties on all levels are being lost. Or rather, though these ties in some sense exist, they are being weakened by not being recognized and responded to. Do I have a proper relationship of neighbor with someone if I do not see and respond to him in a certain way? Do I have a proper relationship of student to teacher if when I see the teacher outside of class, I offer scarcely a sign of recognition or greeting, not to mention deference? My final point regarding the need for manners focuses on their unique importance in promoting good conversation. Here we have occasion to see a surprising aspect of manners. It might seem that strict customary forms of speaking, that is, certain formulae that by custom are to be used in certain circumstances, tend by their very formality to be a hindrance to good conversation. But experience shows just the opposite. This has become especially apparent to me when I observe young people meeting one another for the first time. We all know that finding a place to begin is often the hardest part of a conversation. I'm convinced that many youth today miss out on countless conversations that should have happened precisely because they have not the customary manners to jumpstart them. In the name of spontaneity, we have deprived ourselves of the cultivated soil from which the spontaneous might have grown. In our age, in which a number of other trends are seriously threatening our ability to have good conversations, this aspect of manners takes on a special importance. I turn then to my third and final part of the lecture, wherein I will briefly offer a few suggestions regarding what can we do to reclaim manners. The first step in reclaiming manners is to be intentional, realizing both our weakness in manners and their real importance. We set our minds to do something about it. This intentionality in itself is not difficult, and it has an immediate advantage. Our manners are less likely to become rote or to be an empty shell. We will be crafting our manners to be what they should be, an expression of interior dispositions. Indeed, an expression that will also deepen them. A first principle will be to be reasonable and flexible. When using certain customary forms will adversely affect others or unreasonably draw attention to ourselves, then we forego them. In some cases, in other words, good manners call for refraining from the forms we otherwise would have used. An obvious example is not offering your seat on a bus to a woman that you know will be offended by the offer. Another example is not insisting on using antiquated forms that have simply lost their meaning. And of course, it goes without saying that only in very rare cases do we correct the manners of others. What areas might we begin to focus on? Let me offer a few thoughts on introductions and greetings. The good news here is that proper introductions, while seldom done anymore, will nevertheless not appear as ostentatious when done well. Mom, I'd like to introduce my roommate, Kate. Professor Jackson, I'd like you to meet my brother. Similarly, giving people a friendly greeting, especially by name, is well within our power and is universally well received. When entering a small room or a small gathering, such greeting is almost always in order. More informal passing by someone that we know, and in a small community, even those we don't really know, calls for a nod, a smile, and often also some polite formula. Have a good afternoon. When those we pass are our superiors in some way, the need for greeting is even more urgent. Another couple of areas on which we might fruitfully focus are dress and posture and comportment. A couple quick thoughts. It goes without saying that our habits of dress have become increasingly informal. Sometimes we don't even hold ourselves to look tidy and clean. We seem not to realize that how we dress is a way of respecting not only ourselves, but also those around us. When we are invited somewhere, anywhere, it's fitting to ask ourselves, am I dressed and groomed in such a way as to please and respect my company? Am I wearing work clothes or sports clothes in non-work and non-sports environments? We all know that very casual clothing can be easier and more comfortable, and it's easy to let comfort become the determining principle of how we dress. Good posture has always been prized. Indeed, in an earlier age, clothes were designed to help form it. Proper posture should be considered in almost all areas of our activities. How we stand, how we walk, how we sit. At issue here, as in so many aspects of manners, are self-respect and acting with dignity, respecting others, showing regard for their presence. In his rule, the great St. Augustine writes, "In all your movements, let nothing be done to offend the eye of another, but only that which is becoming to the holiness of your state." My final practical point is to encourage that we take a serious look at music. Good music encourages good manners. Bad music does the opposite. Allow me to give you two more quotations from Plato's Republic. Quote, "Then fine words, harmony, grace, and rhythm follow simplicity of character." And I don't mean this in the sense in which we use simplicity as a euphemism for simple-mindedness, but I mean the sort of fine and good character that has developed in accordance with an intelligent plan. Next. Aren't these the reasons, Glaucon, that education in music and poetry is most important? First, because rhythm and harmony permeate the inner part of the soul more than anything else, affecting it most strongly and bringing it grace. So if someone is properly educated in music and poetry, it makes him graceful. But if not, then the opposite. I cannot but think, ladies and gentlemen, that the low music that has become our standard fare is yet another significant factor that works against good manners. On the other hand, the music of a Bach, Haydn, or Mozart fits with and will support our intentional cultivation of manners. In all these things, we might bear in mind the words of Xenophon. Speaking of the multiple and varied practices of a household, he said, quote, "All these things are interconnected." Indeed, our efforts in the area of manners can be seen as a significant part of our efforts to grow as persons and to grow as a community. And I thank you very much.